Good morning, everyone. And as any good forum, the sessions take longer, and the conversations after the sessions are very interesting. So we are a little bit running late on this session, but I wanted also to give the possibility for everyone to trickle in, because we are continuing in the topic that started this morning and that kick off our plenary, that's trust in science. And in this panel, what we want to explore is how can we promote effective science policy, society nexus and interface, and the values in science in order to strengthen trust in science. Distinguished participants, colleagues, friends, so welcome to this high-level roundtable where we wish, as I mentioned, to explore with you and the panel the critical nexus where science meets policy to address the needs of society. From the technological devices we use to communicate to the medical breakthroughs that extend our lifespans, science not only underpins our daily life, it is key to responding to many of today's challenges. From pandemics to climate change, natural and social science, all the key to peaceful and sustainable solutions that leave no one behind. As science becomes integral to public policies, foreign policies, and multilateral relations, science-based solutions and decisions need to become the norm and not the exception. Trust in science is critical for unlocking the potential of science to respond to societal needs. When trust is eroded, we open the door to conspiracy theories, misinformation, and disinformation, and we have seen plenty of that during the COVID pandemic. Our policies cease to be anchored in scientific evidence, and our societies are reluctant to comply with scientific advice. Ultimately, this leads to greater vulnerability to the challenges we face, and of course, it also makes inequalities growing. And violence is therefore only a step away. To strengthen trust in science, whether the natural, social, or human sciences, we need to build the culture of science through clear principles and appropriate legislation. And that is at the heart of UNESCO mandate in science. We have to this end, develop two powerful normative instruments adopted by all our member states. UNESCO 2017 recommendation on science and scientific researchers and the 2021 recommendation on open science. While the 2017 recommendation ensures a safe and inclusive scientific ecosystem and the protection and freedom of scientists, the 2021 recommendation on open science ensures that scientific research is accessible to as many people as possible. And in effect, we just discussed in the last panel, open science and open science principles ensures co-design, co-production of knowledge, co-implementation of that knowledge for development. It ensures inclusion, fairness, transparency, and impact. So transparency around the ethical issues that science gives rise to is another essential element of trust in science, as highlighted in our recommendation also of ethics of artificial intelligence. But to accelerate progress and extend our actions, we, of course, again, as the last panel mentioned, we need to collaborate together. We need to engage all stakeholders in order to build this partnership and this coalition towards a stronger trust in science and also a science that responds better to societal needs. And that's why we are here today, to explore precisely the diversity of stakeholders that we have in the panel, to listen to them, to see what is their experience, and how can we together advance this important agenda of strengthening trust in science for sustainable development. So I'm very happy to have this wonderful panel, high-level panel with us today. And I will very quickly introduce them, and then I will give them some initial space for the first reflection, and then we explore some other discussions. So the first one, and I'm starting from the far right, Mr. Tiago Braga, Director of the Brazilian Institute of Information on Science and Technology. Bem-vindo. I also want to introduce Mr. Laszlo Bodis, Deputy State Secretary for Innovation of the Ministry of Culture and Innovation of Hungary. Thank you very much for being here. It was a pleasure to exchange some ideas yesterday when we visit His Excellency the Minister, and so thanks for being here. I know how busy you are. I want also to recognize and introduce Dr. Ruth Morgan, Professor at UCL Arista Institute of the University College of London, and of course Professor Ana Maria Scheto, from the Institute of Physics of Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Bienvenida. So it's really a great and very diversified panel that I think will help us to understand how can we move from different stakeholders' point of view. And so my first question to the four of you for your introductory remarks, it's based on what you do, what you have experiences in terms of issues that are related to luck, of trust in science. So what are those issues? Are they changing over time? And today, what are the major ones that are really jeopardizing the trust in science of our society? So I will start with Tiago, go this way, and then I move around. Tiago.
First, I would like to thank the colleagues from the Hungarian Academy of Science for inviting me to join this important panel. The topic addressed here is important because what we have been seeing during the last years is some tentative of distrusting science institutions, science community, and the science process. So I would like to congratulate you for shedding light to this topic. My name is Tiago Braga, and currently I'm director of the Brazilian Institute of Formation in Science and Technology, known as IBICT. And we have been promoting science infrastructures for the past 71 years. The mission of IBICT is to provide information infrastructures in science and technology to promote Brazilian development. Therefore, we must work together with specialists from different fields. As information is our main business, the information disorder we are facing right now is the antithesis of what we represent. It is also the antithesis of science itself, as science relies on the trust built through a rigorous process over time. When I talk about information disorder, I'm bringing together concepts like misinformation, disinformation, fake science, and others. But I'm also meaning the inability of part of our society to understand scientific concepts or to misunderstand them. And there is also the problem of people that consider science a question of ideology or political preference and base their trust on what have been discussed in their small world. The concept of small world is when someone does not believe in information presented by people outside from their group. In the past, our small world was based on the place we live, or study, or work. Nowadays, however, we used to consider our small world the group of people we met online in social networks like X, YouTube, TikTok, or Instagram. We also consider part of our small world the giant groups we join in instant message apps like WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, and so on. This expanded small world could be a place where we share good and quality information. But what we have been seeing in our experience is that it's being used to spread fake science and disinformation. And as people tend to consider information presented by members of the small world more relevant than information from outsiders, this digital expanded small world becomes a decisive space for not recognizing science as an important element in societal development. So this disorder is causing a lot of issues. I would like to present a personal experience I had during the COVID situation in 2020 in Brazil. During the first months of the pandemic, a gastroenterologist contacted our institution to present an yearly preventive treatment for coronavirus. It was in May that year, and at that point, we had a lot of unanswered questions related to the disease. So we received him at our institution. He presented a chlorine dioxide protocol and in an assertive way guaranteed that it prevents the infection related with coronavirus. Then he asked our help to present it to the height level. At that point, we asked him to present the scientific evidence, and he proposed to send them by mail. A week later, he sent the email with an attached file containing scientific papers related to what he had presented before. We analyzed the files, and all the evidence was based on papers published 10 to 20 years ago, and have no relation with the crisis we were facing in 2020. So we informed him that we could not support his claim and dismissed him. 1 year later, in 2021, surprisingly, a project proposal focused on chlorine dioxide was presented by one federal deputy. This bill aimed to obligate hospitals to provide treatment based on the same exact chlorine dioxide protocol. And in 2022, our federal agency had to make significant efforts to inspect this chemical commercialization, and it was forbidden since 2018 when it was linked to other disinformation. Fortunately, the bill did not pass, but this personal example highlights how a false statement based on fake science can be dangerous and, in a favorable environment, spread and have catastrophic consequences. What I would like to emphasize is that to avoid such situations, we must focus on creating a scientific environment that promotes societal engagement. If we cannot involve ordinary people in what the science can offer to society, we will spend time and effort on doing bad science. And it seems that a reactive approach is not the best strategy in this case. We believe that the scientific community already has the tools, but we need to use them properly. At EBICT, we are promoting two very important concepts that you are already familiar with: open science and citizen science. However, fostering trust in science is not just about understanding these concepts. We must apply them in ways that make a real difference. We have been promoting open science for the past 20 years, although at the time we referred to it as open access, with a primary focus on expanding access to publications. Over time, we realized it was important to open other aspects of scientific infrastructure beyond just research results. We referred to that as open science. The concept of open science is wonderful, but its promotion is not easy. Science is a very profitable business, and make it open requires navigating a very established scientific ecosystem. While some traditional publishers are moving toward open science, the APC, article process charging, is sometimes more expensive than the previous cost of accessing. So it does not solve the access issue in the world's peripheral countries. In fact, this charge can amplify the already existing inequalities between researchers from different countries and institutions. Open science is not just about making the science more accessible. It relies on making it more inclusive, incorporating and giving floor to researchers from diverse groups and regions. It is also difficult to convince some scientists of the importance of open science, as making their research open often involves more work and, at times, less recognition. Finally, it's essential to convince policymakers about the importance of open science, because without financial support and funding, we will lack the infrastructure needed to sustain it. Regarding citizen science, it is a way for us to engage society in what we do. However, for citizen science projects to be meaningful, it's essential to have funding time. If a scientist wants to involve citizens in their research, it's necessary to have time. And time is something that our scientific community often lacks. Sorry, how many minutes do I have? 7. Okay. These two tools, open science and citizen science, are the means we believe can improve trust in science. So we would now like to present a few projects we have been working on based on these tools. The BR-CRIS is a current research information system. It's used to share information related to funding. Okay. Okay, sorry. So I will finish here. Thank you.
Sorry. You will come back with the questions, then you can explore the projects, because I think it's important that we also get some practical examples. And thank you very much also for raising, in one end, a very concrete example during COVID of fake science that was going around not only in Brazil, but also the importance of citizen science as part of building trust, and we just mentioned that also in the previous panel. But I'm going now to a stakeholder also from the government side, but the Deputy State Secretary for Innovation. So what's your take on this first question?
Dear Excellencies, dear distinguished guests, I will be no longer than 7 minutes, I promise. It's an honor to be here at the World Science Forum, representing the Hungarian Ministry responsible for research and science. Allow me to guide you through this topic in 7 minutes, no more, via 3 key questions in my introductory remarks, as I personally see it. Borrowed from Simon Sinek, I guess most of you know him, he's a well-known management guru. The 3 questions will be why, how, and what. It is of crucial importance that our most important stakeholders, basically people, to understand why, how, and what science and scientists, together with policymakers, and how all this is connected to their everyday life, because that will lead us to increasing trust in science. So let's start with the why, which is, I think, the most important questions of all 3. One of the most important reasons people might feel disconnected from science is when they don't see it addressing their everyday concerns. When scientific funding and research priorities align with the needs and values of a society, people are more often likely to feel a sense of trust and respect for scientific institutions. Science can gain trust by actively engaging in these pressing societal issues and ensuring that solutions are equitable, ethical, and inclusive. We should ask, how do we ensure that our scientific endeavors respond to real-world challenges that matter to the public? For example, let's take climate action. For people in vulnerable communities, this isn't a theoretical concern, but a matter of survival. But we can also mention a lot of other things, the great challenges of our time, such as healthy aging, climate neutral energy production, or sustainable food management systems. Science can inform policies, making them evidence-based, while policymakers can ensure that scientific insights are used responsibly and ethically. This collaboration should be two-way, obviously. Policymakers need to be scientifically informed, and scientists should understand policy processes and also constraints. The task of the policymakers is to clearly and comprehensively define and explain the challenges. We can call them missions as well, in the solution of which the scientific community is expected to contribute. The task of the scientific community is to respond to these challenges. We must realize that together, curiosity-based research and mission-driven research are not competitors, as it is often the case in the public discourse today, but curiosity-driven research should lead to the solution of our great challenges. This is, of course, closely related to the matter of scientific communication. Science needs to reach beyond the academic world. Clear, relatable communication bridges the gap between scientific insight and societal understanding. Obviously, this isn't easy. We have to make a huge improvement in that. So, in summary, I see that the most important task in the fact that we, policymakers and scientists, can jointly explain to our communities and societies that the ultimate goal of scientific research is to create new knowledge through which people's everyday lives can be made simpler and better. If we have a common understanding of the why, then we can move on to the next question, which is how. In other words, in order to strengthen trust in science, researchers and policymakers must pay attention to how they do their work so that people understand not only the goals, but also how these goals will be reached. Just allow me to highlight three most important pillars here. The first is transparency in the scientific progress. People have to see how science works, its rigor, its methods, its corrections, and also its limitations. Then they're more likely to trust its results. An essential aspect of this transparency is to being honest about uncertainty. Often people are frustrated when scientific conclusions seem to change. But this is precisely how science works. It's a journey of ongoing discovery where new data and technologies allow us to refine our understanding. The second pillar, as was also already mentioned, is combating misinformation. And the third pillar is engaging the public directly, which is another crucial element of building a trustworthy science-society relationship. If we succeed in achieving that society understands why and how scientists and policymakers work together, we can reach a state where trust and science will be significantly strengthened. And if this is the case, then the question what exactly scientists do, even if it sounds strange, becomes a secondary issue at the level of our societies, since people understand and know the scientists do their daily work reliably and in their interest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for again mentioning some pillars such as disinformation and how to combat that, and then science communication and how we communicate that, but also the involvement of both communities, stakeholders, the policymakers, but also society at large. So, and also the relevance of science as part of building trust. But I will go now to Professor Ruth Morgan. What's your take on these issues, and what is your experience, and how is it changing over time? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to join you. It's a real honor. So I bring the university perspective as a researcher who's been in a university for a number of decades now, not just one. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of my journey because I think it exemplifies in a specific example a lot of the issues that we've mentioned, and hopefully it just gives a bit of a sense of this as it's been experienced from the science side, I guess. So my specialist discipline is forensic science, and I started in forensic science more than 20 years ago now. And forensic science as a discipline has been on a very significant journey. it's benefited a lot from great media coverage, the CSIs, the silent witness, the Dexters of the media world, the storytelling. But it's also gone under a huge amount of scrutiny. So in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report that basically said, we've got a very serious concern here because there is not a very strong scientific evidence base that underpins the science that is going into court, particularly how we interpret that science evidence in casework. So it was in that context that I was able to set up a multidisciplinary research institute to address that very specific issue. How can we build an evidence base to support the evaluative interpretation of science evidence as it goes into court? And all was going quite well. We were able to do an awful lot of multidisciplinary experimental work that actually plugged that gap. It was an issue where there wasn't enough knowledge, and we were able to produce it through the scientific method, through scientific processes. But a few years in, it was all, we had this gap well on its way to being addressed. We were building that good evidence base. And I was walking back from a meeting, and I just had this moment of, gosh, the science is now there, but things haven't fundamentally changed in the justice system. We still have science going into court that is based on assumption that doesn't have sufficient scientific evidence behind it, even though the science does exist now. And it was a real moment for me as a researcher that science, excellent science, is step one. But we're missing a very, very critical part of this process if we're not then getting that science into the hands of those who can use it. So in my case, that was within the court system. And not just get the science to them, but get it in a way that engages, that connects with the challenges that they're dealing with, and connects with the context within which they are working and the problems that they're trying to solve. And this is the case for forensic science, which is an applied discipline. It's not as if we're not aware of the impact that the science needs to have. And so this really took me on a journey with the research that we were doing within the university. How can we make sure that the research that we do is going to have impact in the different spaces in which it is necessary if it's going to actually change things for the better? So that means thinking about the policy world, the legal world, and the public who sit on juries and ultimately have to decide whether or not the evidence they've heard is indicative of guilt or innocence. So as I worked with people in the UK Parliament, I worked with lawyers, I spent a lot of time on public engagement. And it became incredibly clear that for science to engage, for science to be at the table rather than on tap, we need to have trust. And trust is manifested in people. It's not really in things, it's in people, it's in relationships. So we're not solely having to think about science and society. We're thinking about trust between people. So scientists and policymakers, scientists and members of the public and policymakers. It's in those people-to-people relationships where the trust is absolutely critical if that science is going to get from science into policy. And it became clear as we were developing the research within the institute that I now run with my co-director, called the Arista Institute, which brings together engineering science, social science, arts and humanities, that actually this particular example was incredibly indicative of a lot of other challenge areas where science is necessary, but not always getting where it needs to get to in the way that it needs to get there. And as we've been thinking about that, a really important part of this story becomes the social contract for science. The social contract for science has changed over the years, and the key driver of that change, when you start mapping it, is the erosion and loss of trust. So the social contract of science really emerged in the 40s as the world was emerging from World War II. And it was essentially a framework where society gave funding and autonomy to researchers in the belief that the outputs of that research would bring benefits to society, new discoveries, new applications. And it was recognised that it was really important for the researchers to have freedom to work on basic science as well as applied science. So this idea that it was possible to do science that didn't have an immediate application. And that was very fertile ground for scientists to discover, to innovate, to experiment, and to discover. As things progressed through the 20th century, we saw lots of really interesting times where the impact of science was having increased visibility, lots of positive outcomes, ranging from household appliances that increased the quality of life for large members of society, through to the science that got man to the moon. But there were also some problematic outcomes of the science developments. Pesticides in the environment, concerns with genetically modified crops in certain sectors of the population. And it became clear that not all science is going to have universally believed positive outcomes. And that led to a real shift in the social contract. Publicly funded science needed to become able to demonstrate that it was socially cognizant, it needed to incorporate an appreciation of complexity, and it had to demonstrate that its outputs were really, really clearly relevant to society. And that really led to a transition from that original framework where there was a lot of trust imbued in scientists towards a situation where publicly funded research, just like other publicly funded institutions, needed to be accountable and demonstrate value for money. And I think more recently, the last 20 years, we've seen another shift happen again. We're using the term polycrisis a lot now. There's an awful lot of situations that need scientific insight to help us solve the challenges that we've got. And an awful lot of excellent science is going into addressing those challenges. But what we're also seeing is that the social science, the social contract for science in its current form isn't imparting the degree of autonomy in researchers that was evident in its earlier incarnations. And it's become far more sort of similar to a contractor relationship. So we've got a need over here, we need to bring the scientists in to solve it. And in some situations, that's led to a real lack of resourcing of basic research and a real focus on looking at science that can make an impact in the short term. And I just think it's very interesting that this evolution has been really precipitated by an erosion of trust. And so, as I conclude, I really want to explore this idea that if we want to have effective channels for excellent science to get into the hands of those who can use it for good, we need to really think collectively about what is the next chapter of the social contract for science. Because then we can start working out how we need to work together, how we can rebuild the trust that is needed for that to be an effective process. Now, there are no easy answers. I'm very aware this is incredibly complex, it's incredibly nuanced, it's always incredibly context sensitive. Different places are going to require different approaches for this to be successful. But I'd like to just leave you with an observation, which is that relationships are built, survive, and thrive on dialogue. Dialogue that's open-ended, that's constructive, that's ongoing. And so if we want to rebuild trust, if we want to get science into the hands of those who can use it, we need to be serious about dialogue. Dialogue that crosses the traditional boundaries of discipline, sector, generation, and culture. So let's have a conversation about what this next chapter of the social contract for science needs to look like. Let's have an honest conversation about how we can reconnect, how we can build trust, so that science and scientists can do what they do best, which is serve society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And I will ask now Anna Maria Scheto also to give your perspective. You have been in many of these discussions and in a way even discussing the social contract that Ruth mentioned and fighting for it, for the autonomy and for the scientific and academic freedom to do research that was important from a science community perspective. So, Anna Maria, to you. Yeah, you speak there. I have to say, we don't hear you very well when you are there. Maybe the public hears well, but for us, we don't hear as well when you are in the podium. But you can, speak where you want, where you are comfortable. I think for the audiences, both are okay. It's for us because you are behind us, so we don't hear, at least I don't hear well.
Hello? Yes? Thank you. No, then I think it's better so that there is a dialogue also among us. No? Well, thank you, Lydia. And for me, this is an opportunity to combine several things that have been on, let's say, a subject for debate, discussion during this forum, namely trust in science and open science and science literacy, which is one of the focuses of the International Decade for Sciences for Sustainable Development. And rather than starting with just one example, I would like to begin by noting that in Mexico, which is my country, and more generally, I think, in Latin America and the Caribbean, the issue is not so much whether the public trusts science or not. The problem is that science is something alien to the majority of the population. People have no connection with it. They are driven by technology. In fact, we are all being driven, pushed, and dragged by technology, I would say. But science and technology are two very different things, and sometimes we tend to forget that. There is little public awareness of the fact that today's technology is based on science. It is very much science-based already for decades, but more and more so. And this technology, through the widespread use of the proliferating social networks, sometimes with anti-scientific messages, and mobile phones and other gadgets, is one of the main drivers of these impressive social transformations that are currently underway and that we have to take very seriously into account if we want to make a change through science and science literacy. But it's not the only driver of social transformations. Another driver that we cannot sufficiently estimate is migration, both from rural to urban areas in most of the world, and across borders, especially from south to north, as a result of growing global asymmetries. You know, Latin America and the Caribbean is not the poorest region of the world, but it is the most unequal, with huge local and regional socioeconomic disparities. We live in a fragmented society. Sometimes entire villages are abandoned because their inhabitants are displaced for lack of means of survival or wars, or because of drug cartels or armed groups depriving them of their land, or they are forced by climate change, by extreme droughts or extreme floods, etc. And I'm not talking just about a few. There are 172 million people in our region that do not have sufficient income to cover their basic needs. And the result, violence breaks out, families are separated, traditional communities break up, leaving behind their modus vivendi and their work, their cultural and social ties, their contact with the natural environment, and their mother tongue. People suffer a loss of identity, and in the end, new communities are formed among people who hardly know each other. Not surprisingly, social and human relations have become more violent, and this is also manifested at the level of families and schools, sometimes reaching a level of extreme aggression, as was recently recognized by UNESCO on the occasion of the International Day Against Violence and Bullying at School. Well, and moreover, on top of that, the global political atmosphere, marked by persistent economic embargoes, ongoing wars, devastating territorial invasions, and fueled by the increasing use of modern weapons, science-based modern weapons, reinforces the sense that violence is natural, that we must live with it, and that, why not, we can practice it also. So the question is, can science literacy play a role in these circumstances? My short answer is yes, in more ways than one. If it is first integrated into a comprehensive plan that addresses the other issues mentioned above. And I would start by referring to the global policy level, because we are here to discuss policy now. The issue, I think, at the global policy level would be addressed by redirecting investments in science and technology to peaceful uses, and more broadly by devoting every effort to make our world a less violent and more peaceful place to live. Although it would be utopian to think that such a step can be taken in the short term, I think a decision by governments to move sooner rather than later in this direction should be possible and highly desirable. And in this regard, I would like to mention something that our newly elected President of Mexico, who is a lady and who is a physicist, a colleague of ours who studied in our school, has taken, because she participated in the recent G20 forum, and there she made a bold proposal that sounded bold in that environment, namely to take just 1% of the global military spending of today and redirect it to reforestation. I, as a scientist, as a citizen, I would say 1% is very little. We need much more. But maybe she is more realistic. As a politician, she may be more realistic. No? Anyway, I think this is the kind of steps that can be used. Now, at the social level, and speaking for my region, as the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, of the Economic Council of Latin America and Caribbean, has noted recently, the strengthening of social protection systems is a strategic space for the adoption of an integrated approach that can have a significant impact on the reduction of poverty, inequality, low levels of social cohesion, and therefore on achievement of social development. And for this reason, both also our federal government and also the government of Mexico City are indeed investing. They are very socially oriented now. They are led by scientists, but socially oriented. And they are investing heavily in social programs as a priority. These programs include financial assistance in the form of scholarships, the creation of spaces for community participation through workshops and support activities for all ages, for young people, for the elder, etc. The expansion of free health services to the entire population, the expansion of enrollment in schools and universities, etc. And such an inclusive and non-violent environment is conducive to learning and to social bonding, which is also very much needed because of what I said before. And thus, it is that this is the climate needed for effective science education. Of course, this is not enough, and I would end by saying that science and education systems, well, of course, they have a lot of work to do, as we said earlier on, to provide high quality science education. I'm not for excellence. I don't understand excellence in abstract, but yes, we need high quality science education programs and resources for the whole population. And these educational and science systems have to work together with the active participation, co-participation of both scientists, members of the scientific community, and teachers. Teachers are very important if they are to make an effective contribution to science literacy. And this brings me, of course, to the UNESCO recommendation of open science, but I will talk later if there is a possibility. Thank you, Liv.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria, and I think you highlight quite a few things. One is this discrepancy of funding in in science for different purposes. So military science, science for development. So how much are we really putting forward, and thank you very much for highlighting also the bold proposal of President Claudia in terms of changing, or at least redirecting some of those funds for reforestation and for environmental restoration. And you also mentioned about the link between science and education that I think is quite important. But maybe I will give you now for the questions, because now I'm going around for questions. Maybe under the International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development, both science literacy, promoting open science is a key aspect of the decade in terms of building science. So what advice would you have for the international community and for the different stakeholders of the decade? What do we need to do during these 10 years of the decade to really use the potential of open science to build trust in science?
Well, thank you for allowing me to continue. How many minutes do we have now?
And now is 3 minutes.
3,
each, because we have about half an hour before we finish.
Okay, yes. Well, I mean, there are many things to be done, and there have been so many statements, so many declarations, and there is a lot of goodwill among this community. There's not so much political goodwill outside. We can see that there are some political leaders that are taking anti-scientific decisions, no? Not only science-based, they are anti-science-based. And talking about science diplomacy, they are anti-diplomatic also. So that's the world today, and we have to make sure that we can have our voice heard, and that our own political leaders can take this kind of bold steps. I think those are very important. Of course, the UNESCO recommendations can help. In particular, the open science recommendation, which is receiving very different interpretations, but I would like to stress the way we see it in our region. We consider that this open science recommendation is really a way to bring science more to the benefit of the whole population. And I don't want to talk about beneficiaries or recipients, no. It's about working together, no? And this is the way I interpret the opening up of science, of a much closer collaboration between science and the science community and the rest of the population, because we are part of the population. We are not something different, no? And this, for me, I would like to see taken to the government level, to the policy level, but also we need to work more with the citizens, and with the organized citizens, with the NGOs, etc., because they are part of the solution. It's not just the governments. We are lucky now that we have as I said, we have a president who is a scientist and she has a track record in implementing, let's say, science-based solutions to the benefit of the environment and of the society in general, as she was the head of the government of Mexico, of the city of Mexico. And that in itself is helping for the population to have trust, because the population trusts her. Obviously, the population has deposited their confidence in her, because otherwise she would not have received the enormous amount of votes she received. As a scientist, that means that there's not a mistrust in science itself, no? And this is one way of showing it. So I think it's a good example, and I hope it can be replicated. Thank you.
So we need more scientists in politics, and making sure that our leaders have a strong science background, and they themselves are pushing.
If they are transparent and if they are trustworthy, yes.
Of course. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. And I think you put the basis for me to go to Ruth now And Ruth, I want to follow up in what you spoke about, that we need a new social contract with science and science and society. So the social contract is changing because the times are changing. In your view, what would that contract look like, and what are the key dimensions? Because before, the framework was clear in terms of autonomy, of support, but also, of course, a certain level of responsibility from scientists to respond to needs. But that has changed. What is the new social contract that we are seeing emerging?
That's an incredible question. And it's one that I would feel very nervous to articulate with just one perspective. I genuinely think that's something we've got to have a broad conversation about. As a scientist, I think the ideals of autonomy and responsibility are very appealing. I think as somebody who's curious and loves experimenting, being given freedom to go into things that I believe to be important and to be interesting is incredibly valuable, and not having to justify in very short time frames the value of that research is very appealing, but I'm aware that that's just one voice, and that this is something that we need to do collectively. But I do think that trust thing is absolutely critical here, and we're only going to be able to navigate how that contract emerges if there is trust. And that means having opportunities to have conversations, and it's not just well-structured and timetabled conversations, it's the conversations that happen in the midst of everything. It's having people rubbing shoulders in unexpected circumstances. And I'm very aware that we need very different roles in that. So we need people from the science community to have that sort of diplomat role. We need certain people to be able to build very strong relationships and build that trust with very specific key individuals. But we also need storytellers. We need scientists who are able to craft a narrative that connects with the public or with a broader range of audiences, to really distill out what is it that's exciting and what does it connect to that could change things for the better, and how can we collectively enact that change. And I think we also need the connectors. We need the scientists who are able to see how their science connects with other people's science and do that sort of synthesis that, so I often talk about bees, and sorry for those that were in the previous plenary, but bees are very critical for ensuring environments survive and thrive because they cross-pollinate as they go from plant to plant. But there are also certain bees, there are thousands of species of bee, but there's only 6 or 7 species of bee that can actually make honey. And I think one of the key things we need in our science community is to find those people who can transform all that knowledge and insight that comes across the broad range of disciplines and synthesize it, transform it into honey, because honey can go out, honey can be applied and do transformative things. So we need a broad conversation, and we need different roles of people in that conversation. As a community, we need to enable and support each other to play to our strengths.
Thank you so very much, and also thanks for highlighting that it has to be a conversation with several stakeholders, and we are lucky enough here that we have also government and political leaders here. That I hope is just the beginning of, I know, a long and important and deep conversation. But I would go to you, really, Deputy State Secretary, in 2 aspects. One is, as Ruth was saying, the social contract with science is changing, and new dimensions are being brought to it. So it would be interesting to hear from you what are those new dimensions from a policy-making point of view. But Ruth, you also talk about science diplomacy, and also Anna mentioned that. So again, in such a complex world that we are living, we also know that the conversation with policymaking is not only at national level, it also has to be at global level. So what's the role of science diplomacy? And of course, Hungary has a long story history of science diplomacy, and I'm very proud that tomorrow I will visit the Academy for Diplomats to discuss precisely some of these issues. But if you can give us some highlights, what are the new dimensions on this social contract, and what is the role of science diplomacy, and start shaping maybe this new contract that will help us to build trust?
Yes. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think what is most important that people who are, at the end of the day, as taxpayers, fund all research, or mainly all research in our societies, just understand what is researchers and scientists are doing for them, basically. And this should be at the core of this new, let's put it that way, social contract between scientists and society. Because if they feel too far away from what researchers do, then science will be in some tower locked away from them, and they just don't feel on their daily lives the potential impacts that are there. We just don't tell them that these impacts are coming from scientists and scientific research. So basically that's what I would refer to back again to my opening remarks, that and we call it in Europe, for example, mission-driven research. So we should understand what are the great challenges of our times, mention some of them, and we should see, and people should see what are the scientists are doing in order to reach these goals. And somehow I feel like here in Hungary that we have to be translators from Hungarian to Hungarian between scientists and let's say average people, or even policymakers as well. And the second question was about how can we increase the trust, not just here in Hungary, for example, or in a nation, but in international terms as well. You know, the best ambassadors, I think, for this is our greatest scientists. Hungary have a lot of great minds. Back in the history as well, you know that Hungary gave a lot of Nobel laureates for the world. 12 of them were born in Hungary, 18 of them has a Hungarian background of Nobel laureates. I think they're the most important ambassadors for this. You know, in the 40s, 50s, Hungarian scientists were called Martians, people who came from the March, because a lot of them went to the US, physicists, mathematicians, for example, Leo Szilard or Jan Wigner, and they had several and significant impact on physics and mathematics as well. And the second one is, I think, good practice from Hungary is that we have so-called scientific attaches in 15 countries all around the world, from the West, in the US, in the UK, in Germany, but even in South Korea or Japan. These attaches are working for the government, basically, and their work is to create new connections, new scientific or higher education or research connections throughout the world. And they're not working for the government, basically, they're working for the research institutions, for our universities, and all of the ecosystem players in the research ecosystem. I would highlight them as a good practice of Hungary. They're doing a huge and very important work in order to create new connections in the international field.
Thank you very much for dwelling also on the quality and the long tradition of science, as you do have in Hungary and in many parts of this region. But you also raised something that Anna Maria had raised before, that is this disconnect between science and the scientific community and the community at large. And IBIC is very much working on that line, Tiago, because you are an information bureau or an institute to make sure that the knowledge that is created by the Brazilian scientific community is indeed at the service of people. So what are the best practices, if any, in Brazil that connects either through science communication or citizen science that really brings these two communities more near and more engaged with each other? Because again, I think in the previous panel, also this issue of connection between the scientific community and the communities at large, it's an important part of trust. So your experience there, if you can share with us.
Thank you, Lydia, for such a question. In reality, it brings me the chance to present the last point I could not present yearly. And I have to say I'm sorry for exceeding the time. I was previously informed that I would have more time, and I didn't reorganize myself. So what we have been doing, we have looking for funds in other areas than science and technology. So nowadays we have been funded by our Minister of Health and our Minister of Justice to understand how the disinformation process or the disinformation ecosystem it happens, and how the society is affected by it, and how we can counterattack or organize ourselves to have an infrastructure that is strong enough to present the good information to people. And we are doing that based on both concepts, open science and citizen science. And of course, the popularization of science is something that we must take care of. And we are really trying to create methodology to develop capacity building on what we are calling science talkers, the TikTokers of science. So we are trying to develop this methodology so people from high school and from university, they can present scientific concepts to the small world, to the group they are sharing information. And this, I think, is something that we will have here really good result. So these are the things we are working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing the importance of social media and social influencers. During COVID, UNESCO had a very good project generously supported by the European Union in building these fact-checking platforms on COVID science, and really to make sure that both media personnel, but also influencers, had the chance to have a platform where they could check facts with science, scientific facts versus disinformation. I was in Latin America at the time, and for our fact-checking platform, the most users were influencers and young influencers. So we started connecting them with the scientists that were working on COVID research, and you know, and it was amazing the change that we could see also on their own way of communicating science, and we discovered that some of them have a science background, and we don't use their scientific education to really having them, as you were talking about, the connectors and the ones who do the synthesis, and that also goes from one field of science to another and connects it and makes some sense of it. So maybe it's one of the things that we need to think, that in this social contract of science, with science, there are some other stakeholders that may not have been there before. So it's not only the dimensions and the bases and the values inherent to that social contract, but it's also who is there and who is really responsible by several of these aspects. We have time for 1 minute each final comment, what you would like to see in the report, and a message that all of us will take after we go back to our work. And I will start with Tiago at the far end and then move this way.
Okay, thank you. The challenges we face today in the field of science are significant, but they also present an opportunity for growth and improvement. By fostering a culture of open science and citizen science, we can bridge the gap between scientific communities and society, making knowledge more accessible and inclusive. Through collective efforts, we can counter misinformation and build a stronger, more resilient trust in science, which is essential for societal progress. The initiatives we are working on, Brazil, are just a step in this broader effort to promote science as a tool for development, fostering a positive change in our world. Let us continue to collaborate, engage, and educate to ensure that science remains a pillar of truth and progress for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiago, and also congratulations to Brazil and to President Lula for this new fund related to integrity of information on environmental sciences, and how can we make sure that misinformation and disinformation on what science is saying about environmental issues and climate change and loss of biodiversity, it's fought from the very core of the centers of disinformation. And again, the leadership of Brazil, it's incredible, and thank you very much, because that's one of the areas that UNESCO works very strongly, and of course we will have the secretariat of that fund, so we are also very proud for the trust given to us in manage that important platform. So Laszlo, from your point of view, what is your last message that you want to leave with us so that we can continue building trust in science?
So as we discussed that most of the great challenges what we face today can be solved only by science and research. But the ones who can solve these issues are basically the policymakers and decision makers, and they have to understand what science does for or doing for reaching these goals and solving these problems, and they have to work very strongly together, as we discussed. But I think that we have to put more emphasis on building these connections between scientists and policymakers, because this is just not gonna go by itself. We have to work on that very seriously.
Thank you. Ruth?
I'm going to build on that. I think change is only going to happen collectively, so we need to be working together, and that's going to require everyone to be courageous and to be humble and to listen as well as to speak, and we need to embrace diversity across the scientific community, across the policy-making community, across our broad societies. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think together we've shown time and time again that we have creativity and ingenuity, and we can make changes.
Thank you. Anna?
Yes, I think we have to take very seriously into account the deep social transformations of today that are affecting all generations, all ages, people, elder people and people of middle age, but especially the younger generation. The younger generation is perhaps digitally literate, but not scientifically literate, no? So we have to use the digital means also, as with your example, which I find wonderful. There are indeed many opportunities that have been opened by these technologies, but we are not using perhaps we are not getting the best out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have 6 minutes, and I'm so happy because of that, because I'm going to ask 3 persons of the audience, only 3 because we don't have more time. Give your message. What did you go out with from this panel? And I will have to change like this, so I start with the lady there, and then I have a gentleman here. Okay.
Just a comment. Hungary has 15 scientific attachés in the world. Why SICA, which is an environment in Central America cannot consider to have its scientific attaché?
That's a question, so we will reflect, but I have the lady there, and then a gentleman here, and then another gentleman there.
We have to encourage, me, Amal Amin from Egypt, from the National Research Center, we have to encourage scientists themselves to begin the dialogue. We have to have multidisciplinary dialogues. We need a World Science Forum every 2 years to speak to each other. So we are working as separate islands. We have to communicate. And we have to trust that science needn't trust. Science and scientists are trustful by themselves, so that we have to begin. We have to work like messengers. We have to begin that dialogue as scientists, and we have to communicate to our societies and to be in the lobe of our societies. Thanks.
That's a good point. We have to trust each other in science. So I have the gentleman here, and we have to interact more, and we have to build together with our societies. Thank you for that position.
Thank you very much. I am very much interested to linking trust building, and responsibility. Responsibility of both sides. I am about basically of science, policy, nexus. The role of science in relation to responsibility. As a matter of fact, very frequently, representatives of different disciplines compete with each other. But actually, they are also responsible if there is a challenge, any kind of challenges, to somehow combine the various aspects, dimensions of the problem. Not only social science, environmental science, economic-related one, when they really come up with a concise, science-based advice for decision makers. On the other side, politicians, especially the high-ranking policymakers, they have also a very special responsibility when they are selective which kind of advice they accept. They also responsive whether to support or interfere with the neutrality or freedom of the science. These two sides of responsibility is a vital one. So I am very much interested in the panelists, how they see this so-called trust-related their responsibility from the point of view of the scientist and point of view of the high-ranking policymakers.
We are very short of time, but I think it's an interesting point. And I think links a little bit with the previous speaker said about trusting among scientists themselves and working together, as you were mentioning, transdisciplinary. But maybe I pass to you. I want to give to any of you. And do you have any response to this trust and responsibility from both sides? Anybody wants to address? Yeah, Anna?
I think the two are very much linked together. In fact, I always see it as a scientist that first I have a responsibility in the first place. And I would like to see that every scientist also feels that he has a professional responsibility. We are privileged because we have been trained as scientists, and with this privilege comes a responsibility, a social responsibility and a moral responsibility. And that's why, for instance, I insist that we should be working for peace. For me, responsibility of scientists and scientists working for war, and many of them are doing, are a contradiction. So this would be my take to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other one? No? Really, and I think Anna Maria in the last panel spoke about social literacy, that scientists have to be also social literate to be able to engage more also with society and policymakers. Very quickly, because we have very few seconds.
I'll be brief. I'd like to resonate what Deputy Secretary Bodish said when he said that the government and the umbrella institutions, headquarters of research networks, universities, have to translate between scientists and the public, especially when publish or perish is the struggling everyday life of researchers nowadays. A very good scientist with cutting-edge research cannot be a scientific communicator, a research group leader, and top scientist parallel continuously at full throttle. One of these will perish. And communication and trust in science can only be built if these institutions responsibly help scientists, and scientists are responsible for producing cutting-edge scientific results, which help society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, 000 means there is a next session coming in. But I really, really want to thank, first of all, my panelists. So a round of applause to them, because I think, and I think this idea of a new social contract with science, I think this idea of trust, responsibility, how do we build that? How do we trust ourselves in the scientific community? How do we build the trust with other stakeholders? And I think a very important point is this idea of new stakeholders in the social contract with science that may help us to really build a trustful environment that, again, we will see science for peace, science for development, science for all. I thank you very much again for being here.